In the unforgiving skies above the Solomon Islands, December 1942, a young man named Eddie Kowalski, a mere 19 years of age, found himself braced in the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress. His role was that of a waist gunner, and his hands were clamped firmly around the vibrating Browning M2 machine gun, which pulsed with intense energy. Suddenly, a Japanese Zero fighter materialized at his 10 o'clock position, an estimated 300 yards distant, slicing across his visual field from left to right with the swiftness of an arrow. Acting on pure, primal instinct, Eddie aligned his crosshairs directly onto the enemy aircraft's fuselage and unleashed a torrent of 50 rounds. He watched, mesmerized, as the tracer fire arced gracefully through the air, only to see every single bullet harmlessly trail behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot, seemingly unconcerned, continued his trajectory without the slightest evasive maneuver, leaving Eddie's ammunition counter to spin precariously towards Zero. This was not a personal failing on Eddie's part. Indeed, this exact scenario unfolded thousands of times across every theater of World War II during its initial years. American gunners, despite being meticulously trained, highly motivated, and equipped with the era's most advanced machine guns, were consistently missing their targets. It was not an occasional oversight, but a pervasive and alarming pattern. A critical study was commissioned by the Army Air Forces in early 1943, meticulously analyzing gun camera footage gathered from bomber missions undertaken across both the European and Pacific fronts. The revelations from this investigation were nothing short of disastrous. It was discovered that even highly trained aerial gunners were achieving dismal hit rates, falling below 4% when engaging crossing targets. To put this into stark perspective, for every 100 rounds discharged at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicularly to the gunner's position, 96 bullets failed to connect, vanishing harmlessly into the vast expanse of the sky. The underlying mathematical realities were brutal and unforgiving. A typical aerial engagement might span a mere 8 to 12 seconds before the adversary fighter disengaged or moved beyond effective range. The Browning M2, a formidable weapon, boasted a firing rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute, translating to about 13 rounds every second. Thus, in a 10-second skirmish, a gunner could theoretically propel 130 rounds into the air. Yet, with a 4% hit rate, this meant a meager 5 bullets might actually impact the target. Such a paltry number of hits was woefully insufficient to bring down a nimble Zero, let alone a more robust and heavily armored aircraft like the German Focke-Wulf FW-190. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. German and Japanese fighter aircraft possessed an astonishing capacity to absorb numerous .50 caliber rounds and still remain airborne. The human toll extracted by this inefficiency was truly staggering. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, operating over the European theater, sustained an average loss of 188 bombers each month. Given that each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men, this translated to a devastating loss of 1,880 air crewmen, either killed, captured, or declared missing, every 30 days. A substantial portion of these catastrophic losses stemmed directly from bomber formations that found themselves unable to mount an effective defense against relentless fighter assaults. The gunners, by all accounts, were executing their duties precisely as dictated by their extensive training. They diligently tracked their targets, maintained their sight pictures with utmost concentration, and controlled their bursts of fire with discipline. The core issue was not a deficiency in their courage or an absence of commitment. Rather, the fundamental problem lay with the immutable laws of physics. And physics, it was discovered, held no regard for bravery. Every gunner, driven by an innate impulse, instinctively aimed directly at whatever object they could perceive. This approach, on the surface, appeared entirely logical. One points at the desired target, pulls the trigger, and expects the target to be struck. This straightforward logic functions perfectly well when one is engaging a stationary target on a firing range, or even when hunting a deer moving at a relatively modest 20 miles per hour. However, enemy fighter planes were far from passive deer. They were hurtling across the gunner's field of vision at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, with some of the later war models, such as the Me-262 jet, reaching an astonishing 540 miles per hour. At such incredible velocities, the brief but critical interval required for a bullet to travel from the gun's muzzle to the target's predicted position meant that by the time the projectile arrived, the target was no longer there. The bullet itself traveled with immense speed, approximately 2,900 feet per second, upon exiting the barrel of a Browning M2. This velocity might suggest instantaneous impact, and indeed, at very short ranges against slow-moving targets, it was effectively so. Yet, in the arena of aerial combat, short range typically implied distances of 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have been deemed unfathomable just 2 decades prior. A Zero, flying at 300 miles per hour, covered a distance of 440 feet every single second. Performing the calculations for a 300-yard shot, which equates to 900 feet, reveals that at 2,900 feet per second, the bullet required approximately 0.31 seconds to traverse that distance. This might not sound like a significant duration, but in those 0.31 seconds, that Zero advanced another 136 feet, the equivalent of 11 car lengths. Consequently, the gunner aimed at the aircraft's current location, but the bullet arrived at the position the aircraft had occupied a mere third of a second earlier, thus passing harmlessly through empty air while the enemy fighter continued its path unscathed. This perplexing phenomenon was precisely termed deflection error. Military scientists had grasped this theoretical concept long before the advent of World War II, but comprehending something within the confines of a classroom was a vastly different challenge from resolving it in the crucible of combat. The required deflection was not a minor tweak. It was a substantial and profoundly counterintuitive adjustment. When confronted with a target crossing at a 90-degree angle at a distance of 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim roughly 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This necessitated placing one's crosshairs on what appeared to be entirely vacant sky, relying solely on the belief that the target would eventually fly into the stream of bullets. Every human instinct vehemently rebelled against such an action. Gunnery instructors diligently attempted to impart deflection shooting techniques during training, but the outcomes were consistently disheartening. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School, situated in Laredo, Texas, implemented rigorous programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent countless hours within turret simulators, practiced firing at towed targets from moving trucks, and meticulously studied diagrams illustrating proper lead angles. Despite these extensive efforts, none of this instruction effectively translated into the chaotic reality of actual combat. The core issue was the inherent complexity. Deflection was not a singular, fixed calculation. Rather, it was a dynamic variable that constantly shifted based on a multitude of factors, including target speed, target angle, range, altitude, whether the target was ascending or descending, and even whether the gunner's own aircraft was maneuvering. For instance, A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-109 performing a frontal attack required a different deflection than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side. And he was afforded perhaps a mere 4 seconds to process all these intricate variables while simultaneously enduring enemy fire, as his aircraft shuddered from flak damage, and as his oxygen mask fogged up at a dizzying 25,000 feet. The psychological barrier proved to be just as lethal as the technical one. Gunners who managed to survive their initial missions and attempted to implement deflection shooting often abandoned the technique after experiencing what appeared to be repeated failures. They would aim ahead of a target, unleash a burst, observe their tracers arcing through the seemingly empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and erroneously conclude that they had led too much. In subsequent engagements, they would invariably reduce their lead, shifting their aim point closer to the visible target. They were, in essence, self-correcting in precisely the wrong direction, placing their trust in their immediate visual perception over the unseen, yet inexorable, laws of physics. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions unequivocally documented this recurring pattern. Initial bursts would show some forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts that progressively walked backward until the gunner was firing directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current position. The casualties continued to mount relentlessly. Records from the 8th Air Force concerning the devastating October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt revealed a 20% loss rate, with 60 bombers failing to return out of 291 dispatched. The surviving aircraft limped back to base, carrying dead and wounded crewmen, with hydraulic lines shredded and engines trailing ominous plumes of smoke. In the post-mission debriefings, gunners consistently articulated the same profound frustration. They had been firing. Their guns had functioned flawlessly, but their bullets simply had not been connecting. Something fundamentally had to change, and it had to change with extreme urgency, because at the prevailing loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign was destined to collapse long before it could ever reach Berlin. The pivotal solution had, in fact, been languishing in a filing cabinet since 1924, penned by a man largely unknown to most combat air crews. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, not to be confused with the historical Puckle renowned for inventing the Puckle gun, was an American artillery officer endowed with an extraordinary aptitude for ballistics. He had authored a highly technical paper titled, "The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery," while serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle was far from a detached theoretical academic. He had served in France during World War I, where he personally witnessed the nascent and often clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat. This experience allowed him to presciently recognize that the burgeoning speeds of aviation were on the cusp of creating a targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship principles simply could not resolve. His paper articulated the underlying mathematics with brutal clarity. Puckle demonstrated convincingly that as aircraft speeds surpassed 150 miles per hour, the required deflection angles would exceed the intuitive capabilities of human gunners. He meticulously calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His comprehensive paper included detailed tables and exhaustive charts, meticulously outlining the required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. For example, a 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300-mile-per-hour target necessitated a lead of 47 feet. The same target at 400 yards demanded a staggering 94-foot lead. These figures were truly astonishing, and Puckle's ultimate conclusion was even more disquieting. Without some form of mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would become effectively useless within a decade. Regrettably, the Army simply filed his paper away and promptly forgot about its critical insights. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation experienced rapid and transformative advancements, yet gunnery training remained stubbornly anchored in World War I methodologies. Instructors continued to teach fundamental marksmanship principles, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, as if their students were preparing for a rifle competition rather than a complex three-dimensional chase unfolding at 300 miles per hour. The few dissenting voices that advocated for advanced deflection training were summarily dismissed as alarmists. After all, the prevailing rationale asserted, Americans had always possessed an inherent prowess as excellent marksmen. The legendary figures of Daniel Boone and Sergeant York, coupled with the deeply ingrained frontier tradition of sharpshooting, surely meant these skills would seamlessly translate to aerial combat with adequate practice. They did not. When the United States formally entered World War II in December 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training programs were catastrophically unprepared for the stark realities of modern air combat. The standard training curriculum lasted a mere 4 weeks. Students fired approximately 1,000 rounds in total throughout their entire qualification course. The vast majority of this ammunition was expended on stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves that moved at a leisurely 150 miles per hour in predictable, straight lines. Not a single training scenario adequately replicated the sheer chaos of an FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour, while simultaneously executing a barrel roll. Consequently, graduates received their wings, boarded their bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered, with chilling clarity, that their training was utterly worthless the very first time a Zero fighter flashed across their gun sight. By mid-1942, as the brutal realities of aerial combat intensified, commanders on the ground found themselves desperately sifting through antiquated technical documents, searching for any insight that might alleviate the dire situation. It was within these dusty archives at Wright Field that Captain Robert Williams, a keen analyst assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, stumbled upon a pivotal 1924 paper penned by Puckle. Williams devoured the entire document in a single sitting, immediately recognizing its profound significance. He then dispatched an urgent memorandum to his commanding officer, emphasizing with triple underlining the stark realization Puckle had foreseen this very catastrophe. 18 years prior to the inaugural combat mission of a B-17 bomber over the European theater, Puckle had accurately predicted the challenges that were now claiming the lives of countless airmen. His intricate calculations remained undeniably precise. His ominous warnings had proven tragically correct. Hundreds of American aircrew had perished, a devastating consequence of these prescient insights having been tragically ignored. The fundamental issue was not the veracity of Puckle's findings. The mathematical underpinnings were irrefutable. Instead, the pressing dilemma revolved around whether any practical countermeasure could be devised. The notion of training gunners to consciously perform complex trigonometric calculations of deflection angles while under the intense duress of enemy fire seemed utterly insurmountable. The human cognitive process simply could not manage such intricate computations at the lightning speed demanded by combat. Yet, if conscious mathematical effort was unfeasible, perhaps an alternative, more intuitive approach existed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British had already begun to forge their own solutions, born from an equally profound sense of desperation during the harrowing summer months of 1940. RAF Squadron 609, operating its formidable Spitfire aircraft from the Middle Wallop Air Base, was grappling with a gunnery crisis that chillingly foreshadowed the challenges American bombers would face 2 years later. Despite the unwavering courage of their pilots and the magnificent engineering of their aircraft, a critical flaw persisted. Their shots were consistently missing their mark. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas meticulously reviewed gun camera footage from engagements throughout July, uncovering a grim reality. His squadron's hit rate against maneuvering Messerschmitt Bf-109s barely hovered around a dismal 6%. This meant that for every 100 rounds discharged, only 6 found their intended target. A Spitfire carried sufficient ammunition for approximately 16 seconds of continuous firing, yet pilots were expending their entire combat load, often with the frustrating experience of watching German fighters disengage and return to base completely unscathed. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask US to stay with US and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. In response to this alarming inefficiency, Squadron Leader Harry Darley, the commanding officer of 609 Squadron, made a truly radical and unprecedented decision. In early August 1940, at the very height of the Battle of Britain, a period when every single fighter aircraft was critically needed in the skies, he grounded his entire unit for 3 full days. During this audacious interlude, Darley orchestrated a series of live-fire experiments that directly contravened every established standard in the RAF's official training manuals. Darley, a highly skilled competitive clay pigeon shooter before the outbreak of hostilities, possessed an invaluable, intuitive understanding of how to lead moving targets, a crucial insight that had been curiously overlooked by conventional military strategists. He recognized that the most adept shotgun shooters did not consciously calculate lead. Rather, they felt it. Their brains instinctively processed the target's trajectory, guiding their hands to position the barrel ahead of the clay disc without any explicit mathematical deliberation. Darley pondered whether fighter pilots could cultivate a similar, instinctual response. His experimental design was brutally straightforward. A Hurricane fighter towed a target banner across a designated gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots executed repeated firing passes. However, instead of adhering to the standard approach, pilots carefully aiming and attempting to compute the precise lead angle, Darley issued an instruction that, at first, sounded utterly nonsensical. Don't aim at all. Instead, he urged them to watch the target's movement. Let your eyes track its path and start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Firing to where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The initial attempts were, predictably, disastrous. Pilots frequently missed the banner by as much as 50 feet, their bullets stitching futile patterns across the empty sky. Yet, Darley compelled them to repeat the exercise relentlessly, 40 passes each over the course of 3 days. There were no lengthy lectures on ballistics, no complex trigonometry lessons, and no tables of deflection angles, only relentless repetition guided by one simple, overarching instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the 3rd day, something truly remarkable began to manifest. The pilots' hit rates, while not skyrocketing dramatically, began to steadily climb, improving from an abysmal 6% to perhaps 12%. This doubling, though seemingly modest, translated directly into twice as many bullets striking German aircraft, which, in turn, meant twice as many enemy kills or twice as many damaged adversaries limping back to base, rendered incapable of flying subsequent missions. Darley meticulously documented his compelling results and formally submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a particularly crucial observation. The pilots, who demonstrated the most rapid improvement were not necessarily those who had excelled in peacetime marksmanship competitions. Rather, they were the individuals who could effectively suppress their ingrained instinct to aim with meticulous precision, and instead learn to trust their peripheral vision and their innate sense of motion. The conscious brain, Darley persuasively argued, was simply too sluggish for the dynamic, high-speed environment of modern air combat. The true solution lay in training the subconscious mind to autonomously manage deflection, much in the same way a baseball player's brain instinctively calculates the trajectory of a flyball without consciously solving complex physics equations. Fighter Command subsequently circulated Darley's groundbreaking findings, but the implementation of his techniques remained scattered and notably inconsistent across the RAF. Some squadrons enthusiastically embraced the new methodology, while others summarily dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's deeply entrenched training command proved particularly resistant, as their seasoned instructors possessed decades of experience teaching traditional marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's innovative approach appeared to abandon virtually everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. However, the undeniable evidence from combat results spoke for itself. Squadrons that adopted motion-based deflection shooting demonstrably achieved superior kill ratios throughout the autumn of 1940. The data was sufficiently clear and compelling that by early 1941, the technique was quietly but steadily becoming standard operational practice, even if the official training manuals had yet to formally incorporate these revolutionary insights. American military observers stationed in Britain diligently recorded detailed notes concerning Darley's innovative methods. However, the United States Army Air Forces confronted a distinct and fundamentally different problem. While fighter pilots could potentially acquire instinctive deflection skills through rigorous repetition, bomber gunners faced a unique set of constraints that made this approach unfeasible. A Spitfire pilot commanded his entire aircraft, leveraging its motion and angles to naturally generate the necessary lead. In stark contrast, a waist gunner in a B-17 bomber stood in a largely fixed position, while his aircraft proceeded straight and level through intense flak, utterly incapable of maneuvering or utilizing the aircraft's movement to generate deflection. His only tools were his hands on the gun and his eyes fixed on the target. If conscious calculation was too slow, and instinctive motion was simply not an option, then the definitive solution had to be mechanical in nature. This pressing need led to the establishment of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically Division 7 of its Radiation Laboratory, in early 1942. The name, Radiation Laboratory, was a deliberate misdirection, designed to suggest atomic research and thereby maintain a high degree of secrecy around Division 7's actual purpose, the development of sophisticated fire control systems. The division was headed by Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a brilliant 40-year-old engineer who had dedicated the preceding decade to pioneering gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Dr. Draper possessed a profound understanding that the pervasive deflection problem was not, at its core, merely about shooting. Instead, it was fundamentally about precise prediction. A truly effective gun sight needed to display to the gunner not the target's current position, but rather its anticipated location at the precise moment the bullets would arrive. The groundbreaking Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in its prototype form by July 1943. It presented an appearance that seemed almost to belong to the realm of science fiction, a reflector sight intricately linked to a complex gyroscope system that weighed a substantial 28 pounds and necessitated electrical power supplied by the aircraft's generator system. The gunner operated this advanced device via a mechanical ranging control. He would meticulously turn a dial to align a set of reference marks with the target's wingspan, thereby providing the sight with the crucial range information it required. Following this, he would track the target for approximately 2 seconds, maintaining its position within a small, designated tracking circle. During these 2 critical seconds, the internal gyroscope precisely measured the target's angular velocity, that is, how rapidly it was moving across the gunner's field of view. This is where the Mark 14 truly became remarkable. Its internal mechanism employed a sophisticated series of cams and gears, essentially analog computers meticulously crafted from machined metal, to solve the complex deflection equation in real time. It seamlessly integrated the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity data from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the powerful .50 caliber round. From these inputs, it then precisely calculated how far ahead of the target the guns needed to be pointed. The result was visually presented as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space, seemingly just ahead of the target aircraft. The gunner no longer aimed directly at the enemy aircraft itself. Instead, he aimed at this luminous dot. And if he had accurately ranged the target and tracked it with sufficient smoothness, that glowing dot showed him precisely where to direct his fire. The Mark 14 was capable of solving mathematical equations that would take a human brain several minutes to complete using pencil and paper, yet it solved these equations 30 times per second, continuously updating its calculations as the target's angle and range dynamically changed. Testing conducted at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, during August 1943 yielded results that bordered on the miraculous. Gunners, who had previously struggled to achieve hit rates better than a meager 5% against crossing targets, immediately saw their accuracy surge to an impressive 18% with the Mark 14, and this significant improvement was observed on their very first day using the system. After just a week of dedicated practice, these rates climbed even higher, surpassing 25%. This represented a 5-fold improvement over traditional manual aiming, a dramatic enhancement that directly translated into 5 times as many enemy aircraft being damaged or destroyed per engagement. However, the immense logistical challenge of manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the entire bomber fleet would require a considerable amount of time, a luxury the Allies simply did not possess. Meaningful production numbers did not commence until early 1944, and installation priority was naturally given to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines rather than retrofitting existing bombers already in service. This meant that the vast majority of gunners flying critical missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still compelled to use basic iron sights or rudimentary reflector sights that lacked any computing capability whatsoever. They desperately needed an immediate solution, one that could be implemented without waiting for new technology or requiring complex electrical modifications to their existing aircraft. They needed a technique that worked seamlessly with the equipment they already possessed. The eventual breakthrough did not originate from the minds of engineers or scientists, but rather from the practical experience of combat gunners themselves, particularly those operating in the Pacific Theater, where engagement distances were often greater and visibility generally superior to the frequently cloud-covered skies over Europe. The relentless conflict of World War II cast its long, dark shadow across Europe. Within this crucible of war, Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a dedicated waist gunner assigned to the USS Lexington's Air Group Support Staff, had, by March of 1944, already accumulated a formidable combat record. He had successfully completed 31 harrowing combat sorties, and remarkably survived the loss of 4 separate aircraft. Fleming was not a commissioned officer, nor did he possess a university degree, and indeed, the intricacies of gyroscopic precession were well beyond his theoretical grasp. However, his practical experience was unparalleled. He had discharged approximately 40,000 rounds in actual engagements and personally observed direct hits on no fewer than 7 enemy airplanes. Beyond his impressive tally of fired ammunition, Fleming maintained a highly unusual personal log. This unassuming notebook held something quite extraordinary: meticulously drawn sketches of hostile aircraft, each accompanied by hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses. These lines precisely indicated where he had actually aimed his weapons during successful encounters. He had devised a pragmatic method for quantifying these critical lead distances, calibrating them against the perceived length of the target aircraft itself. For instance, 2 plane lengths ahead, or perhaps 3 plane lengths ahead, depending on the angle and speed. On March 14, 1944, a pivotal moment occurred when Fleming presented his unique notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare during what was meant to be a routine debriefing. O'Hare, a Distinguished Medal of Honor recipient and widely regarded as one of the Navy's most astute tacticians, instantly grasped the profound significance of Fleming's observations. What he was witnessing was nothing less than authentic, empirical deflection data, meticulously compiled and validated under the most unforgiving conditions of actual aerial combat. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Recognizing the immense potential, O'Hare promptly directed Fleming to initiate a series of intensive training sessions for every gunner within the air group. These instructional periods were far removed from conventional classroom lectures. Instead, they comprised highly practical, hands-on exercises that quickly became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming orchestrated these drills by positioning gunners at their combat stations, while another crew member traversed the flight deck, holding a model aircraft aloft on a pole. As the miniature plane simulated various flight paths and angles, Fleming would expertly guide the gunners, coaching them to extend their aim forward by precise, visually discernible increments: 1 aircraft length for targets at slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for those at moderate angles, and 3 or more for challenging, steep crossing shots. The fundamental genius of this method lay in its ability to furnish gunners with a concrete, visual reference that could be instantaneously recalled and applied. The directive was straightforward: count plane lengths forward from the target's nose, then unleash fire. Initially, the Lexington's gunnery officer harbored a degree of skepticism, yet he was also acutely aware of the desperate need for any viable solution. Consequently, he authorized controlled testing of the new methodology during the carrier's operations near Truck Lagoon in late March 1944. He meticulously gathered data on ammunition expenditure and confirmed hits for the preceding 8 weeks, then rigorously tracked the identical metrics following the implementation of Fleming's innovative training program. The subsequent results were utterly irrefutable. Before the introduction of Fleming's specialized training, the air group's gunners collectively achieved an average of 4.2 hits for every 100 rounds discharged against crossing targets. By the close of April, a mere 6 weeks after the widespread adoption of spot shooting, that critical hit rate had dramatically ascended to 9.1 hits per 100 rounds. This groundbreaking technique had, in essence, more than doubled their combat effectiveness. News of this remarkable breakthrough disseminated through the Pacific Fleet with astonishing velocity. By May 1944, modified versions of Fleming's spot shooting method were actively being taught aboard other prominent carriers, including the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. While the gunnery officers on each vessel introduced their own nuanced refinements, the foundational principle remained steadfast: provide gunners with a straightforward visual measurement system directly correlated to the apparent size of the target, thereby eliminating the necessity for complex, conscious calculation. A gunner was not required to comprehend the physics of compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. Instead, he simply needed to instinctively recall 3 plane lengths forward for an effective crossing shot. The inherent efficacy of this technique stemmed from its profound alignment with the actual mechanisms of human visual processing. Our brains are remarkably adept at discerning relative size comparisons, but notoriously poor at accurately estimating absolute distances. Instructing a gunner to lead by 50 feet proved largely meaningless when he lacked any tangible reference for what 50 feet truly looked like from a distance of 300 yards. Conversely, the command to lead by 2 plane lengths provided an immediate, intuitive visual standard that could be applied without conscious deliberation. The target itself, which the gunner was intently tracking, effectively served as its own dynamic measuring stick. He merely had to project that measurement forward into the seemingly empty space ahead. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces had also embraced similar training protocols, albeit under the designation of radius of action shooting. Technical manuals began to feature illustrative diagrams depicting appropriate lead distances, now expressed as multiples of the target's wingspan or fuselage length. The prestigious 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England, completely restructured its entire training curriculum around this potent technique during June 1944. Although mission loss rates remained a significant concern, a discernible decline began to emerge. July 1944 recorded 3.4% bomber losses per mission, a notable improvement compared to the 5.2% observed the previous October. This seemingly modest difference translated into hundreds of aircrew members who successfully returned home rather than perishing over the skies of Germany. Yet, merely understanding the technique and flawlessly executing it under the brutal pressures of combat remained two fundamentally distinct challenges. The human brain, even when equipped with a sophisticated spot shooting method, continued to wrestle with its own primal instincts once the actual engagement commenced. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces meticulously documented this phenomenon throughout 1944, conducting extensive interviews with returning gunners. The core issue was not a deficit of knowledge. Gunners could effortlessly articulate the correct lead distances during post-mission debriefings. The true problem lay in the fact that conscious, learned knowledge tended to dissipate under extreme duress, supplanted by a deeply ingrained, primal instinct that screamed, "Aim directly at the threat." Captain Harold Clens, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovington, dedicated himself to studying this innate response through a meticulous analysis of gun camera footage juxtaposed with comprehensive post-mission interviews. He ultimately identified a consistent pattern which he aptly termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would typically commence an engagement utilizing proper deflection techniques, but as the enemy fighter closed in and the perceived danger intensified dramatically, their aiming point would progressively drift backward until they were firing directly at or even behind the fast-moving target. Clens compiled data compellingly demonstrated that this collapse occurred most rapidly during head-on attacks, particularly when the closing speed between the bomber and the attacking fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, leaving the gunner with perhaps only 2 precious seconds before the adversary opened fire. Under such overwhelming, extreme stress, rational technique utterly dissolved, replaced by a pure, unthinking reaction: point at the terrifying object, then pull the trigger. The only viable remedy for this deeply ingrained human response was a level of repetition, so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, becoming embedded at the same neurological level as automatic actions, like walking or catching a thrown ball. Such intensive training, however, demanded a significant investment of time and resources that the military simply could not afford during the critical years of 1942 and 1943. Nevertheless, by late 1944, with the Allied forces gradually establishing greater control of the air and training pipelines becoming more robust, gunnery schools were able to extend the duration and intensity of their programs. The standard course, which had been a mere 4 weeks in 1942, was expanded first to 8 weeks, and then to 10. Student gunners now discharged 5,000 rounds during their training, a 5-fold increase from the previous 1,000. Crucially, over half of these rounds were expended against moving targets simulating realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, pioneered a particularly innovative and highly effective drill commencing in August 1944. They ingeniously mounted .50 caliber machine guns on motorized turrets capable of rapid spinning and elevation. High-speed boats were then utilized to tow targets across the water at impressive speeds of up to 60 miles per hour, while constantly varying their distance and crossing angles in a randomized fashion. Gunner trainees engaged these dynamic targets repeatedly, often completing 50 to 70 passes per day, until the complex act of leading became an entirely automatic, subconscious response. Instructors deliberately refrained from verbally correcting students during these drills. Instead, they simply allowed them to shoot, observe their hit patterns, make self-corrections, and then shoot again. The subconscious mind, it was discovered, learned through these immediate, practical feedback loops far more efficiently than the conscious mind learned through explicit instruction. Analysis of combat footage revealed something truly extraordinary about elite gunners who had survived 30 or more missions. Their deflection aim points remained remarkably stable even under the most intense and terrifying stress. When an FW-190 fighter screamed through a formation, its cannons flashing menacingly, these highly experienced gunners instinctively maintained their proper lead. While their conscious minds might have been consumed by terror, many candidly admitted to being absolutely convinced of their imminent demise during certain engagements. Their hands unfailingly maintained the correct sight picture. They had, in essence, achieved what martial artists refer to as mushin, or no mind, a profound state where complex technique unfolds seamlessly, without the need for conscious direction or thought. However, attaining such an exalted level of proficiency demanded both considerable time and a vast expenditure of ammunition, resources that the majority of wartime gunners simply never received. The logistical mathematics of wartime training were undeniably brutal. If forging an expert deflection shooter necessitated 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive instruction, yet the ongoing bomber offensive required 50,000 new gunners within a mere 6-month window, compromises became an unavoidable reality. Consequently, the vast majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competent stage, capable of executing proper deflection shooting when conditions afforded them the luxury of time for deliberate thought, but critically vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when confronted with unexpected tactical scenarios. This inherent disparity inevitably led to a peculiar stratification in combat effectiveness across bomber formations. The defensive firepower of a given formation was far from uniform. It was profoundly dependent on which specific gunners occupied which specific positions on which particular aircraft. A formation that fortuitously included several seasoned veterans with extensive, deep training could often successfully repel attacks that would utterly devastate a formation composed primarily of newer, less experienced crews. German fighter pilots, with their keen observational skills, quickly learned to identify and ruthlessly exploit this vulnerability, deliberately targeting bombers that exhibited hesitant or inaccurate defensive fire during initial passes, while prudently avoiding formations where the defensive barrage was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. The profound shift in targeting methodologies, often termed the deflection shooting revolution, which initially emerged from innovative British trials and the urgent operational demands of American forces, did not merely cease with the cessation of hostilities in World War II in 1945. Instead, its fundamental tenet, the critical imperative to direct one's aim toward the anticipated future position of a moving target rather than its current location, was permanently embedded as a cornerstone for virtually every subsequent weapon system conceived and engineered. This foundational concept saw its early mechanical embodiments, such as the Mark 14 computing gun sight, undergo significant refinement and technological advancement. This sophisticated device subsequently gave rise to the Mark 18, a system that continued its vital service throughout the entirety of the Korean War, before ultimately paving the way for the sophisticated digital fire control computers of later eras, machines capable of instantaneously evaluating and integrating a multitude of variables, often numbering in the dozens, to achieve unparalleled targeting precision. By the period of the Vietnam conflict, the technological landscape of aerial warfare had dramatically advanced, equipping fighter aircraft with sophisticated radar-assisted gun systems that possessed the capability to autonomously compute the necessary deflection angles. This innovation significantly streamlined the pilot's task, reducing their responsibility primarily to maintaining enemy aircraft within predefined acquisition parameters for the system to engage effectively. A prime example of this leap forward was the F-4 Phantom's Advanced Lead Computing Optical Sight System, an apparatus that could execute complex calculations in mere microseconds, a task that had previously consumed significant fractions of a second when performed by Draper's pioneering mechanical gyroscopes. While contemporary air-to-air combat has predominantly shifted away from direct gun engagements, favoring beyond visual range missile interceptions that operate at distances where calculating deflection would necessitate leading a target by several miles rather than just a few feet, it is crucial to recognize that the fundamental physical principles governing projectile motion and target prediction have remained immutable. Only the methods and technologies for their application have undergone profound transformation. Readers are encouraged to remain engaged and continue watching the video until its conclusion. The creators of this content would be immensely grateful for any likes and subscriptions. Additionally, viewers are invited to share their geographical origin in the comments section and offer their thoughts regarding the video's central topic. Consider the sophisticated operation of a modern IM-120 AMRAAM missile, a weapon that leverages a combination of inertial guidance and active radar systems to perpetually refine its flight path. This continuous adjustment ensures it is always directed towards the anticipated future location of its intended target, effectively performing intricate deflection calculations with astonishing frequency, thousands of times every second. Similarly, the F-22 Raptor's advanced APG-77 radar system transcends mere target tracking. It actively forecasts the projected positions of adversaries by meticulously analyzing their current velocity and acceleration vectors. Based on these complex predictions, the system intelligently maneuvers the aircraft and selects the most appropriate weaponry. Fundamentally, this represents the very same challenge that William Fleming ingeniously addressed through painstakingly hand-drawn sketches back in 1944, albeit now managed by high-performance computers capable of processing data at speeds measured in teraflops, a stark contrast to the manual estimations of gunners, who once relied on counting plane lengths to gauge lead. Intriguingly, the foundational principles of deflection shooting persist as an integral component of contemporary fighter pilot education. Even though guns are largely considered tertiary weaponry in the current paradigm of air combat, prestigious institutions such as the Navy Fighter Weapons School, famously known as Top Gun, continue to meticulously instruct trainees in basic fighter maneuvers that encompass guns-only engagements. The rationale behind this enduring curriculum is not predicated on the expectation that pilots will frequently engage in close-range dogfights utilizing cannons. Rather, the rigorous process of learning to visually predict the future trajectory of a dynamically maneuvering target cultivates an exceptional level of spatial awareness, a crucial cognitive skill that is universally applicable across every facet of aerial combat. A pilot who has thoroughly mastered the nuances of deflection shooting instinctively grasps complex concepts such as closure rates, the angle off the target, and the intricacies of lead pursuit curves. These profound understandings are equally critical, whether one is preparing to discharge a cannon or precisely positioning their aircraft for an optimal missile launch. The profound lessons gleaned from deflection shooting extend far beyond the confines of aviation, finding vital application in virtually any operational domain that involves engaging rapidly moving targets. Contemporary anti-aircraft defense systems, ranging from the formidable Phalanx CIWS close-in weapons system, which diligently safeguards naval vessels against imminent threats, to the CRAM, counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar systems meticulously deployed to protect ground bases, fundamentally represent highly sophisticated and automated renditions of the arduous task that bomber gunners in 1943 valiantly struggled to accomplish through manual means. The Phalanx, for instance, exhibits an astonishing rate of fire, unleashing 4,500 rounds per minute, equivalent to a blistering 75 rounds every second, at incoming missiles and hostile aircraft. Its integrated radar system tirelessly performs continuous deflection calculations, constantly refining and updating the optimal aim point. In essence, this advanced machinery executes the very same critical corrections that an individual like Eddie Kowalski would have desperately needed to make during intense engagements over the Solomon Islands, but it does so with incomparably greater speed, unwavering precision, and, crucially, without the inherent human hesitation that tragically led to the loss of countless lives during earlier conflicts. Remarkably, even the realm of interactive entertainment, specifically video games designed to simulate combat scenarios, has integrated the intricate mechanics of deflection. These digital environments serve as virtual instructors, subtly imparting to players the identical counterintuitive principle, the necessity to direct one's aim toward the projected future location of a moving target. Popular titles such as War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator explicitly demand that players manually lead their moving adversaries. Consequently, novice players frequently encounter the precise same profound frustration that actual gunners experienced in 1942, as they observe their digital tracer rounds harmlessly sailing behind enemy aircraft, until they gradually internalize the indispensable requirement of applying lead. As players hone their abilities, the most adept among them eventually cultivate a form of unconscious competence, mirroring the instinctive proficiency attained by seasoned combat veterans. Their hands instinctively make the necessary aiming adjustments, operating with an almost autonomic precision, entirely independent of deliberate conscious thought. The remarkable transformation observed in aerial engagement statistics, specifically the increase from a meager 4% hit rate in the nascent stages of 1943, to an impressive 20% or more by the concluding months of 1944, stands as one of the most profoundly dramatic tactical enhancements witnessed throughout the entirety of World War II. This monumental leap was not primarily attributable to the deployment of inherently superior equipment or the sheer overwhelming force of numerical superiority, but rather to a sophisticated understanding of, and a deliberate decision to work with, the intricate mechanisms of human cognition rather than attempting to overcome its natural inclinations. The direct consequences of this paradigm shift were immense. Literally thousands of air crewmen, whose lives would otherwise have been tragically forfeited, were able to continue their vital missions. Moreover, enemy fighter aircraft that would have otherwise successfully disengaged and escaped were instead brought down in spectacular flames, and critical bombing campaigns, which might well have faltered or failed outright, ultimately achieved their designated objectives with increased efficacy. This monumental shift in effectiveness occurred solely because, at a critical juncture, there was a profound recognition that human instinct, no matter how powerful or deeply ingrained, could indeed be fundamentally erroneous. Consequently, the key to survival lay in meticulously training individuals to consciously disregard what felt intuitively natural, and instead place their unwavering trust in the immutable laws of physics. The dedicated gunners, who painstakingly learned to direct their fire into what appeared to be empty sky, who compelled themselves to discharge their weapons at targets that were not yet visibly present, and who placed their faith in the certainty that their projectiles would ultimately intercept metal, unequivocally demonstrated an essential truth about human adaptability when confronted with extreme pressure. This experience proved that humanity is not irrevocably confined by the dictates of its primal instincts. Given a comprehensive understanding of a problem, coupled with thorough and rigorous training, and, at times, a sufficient degree of desperation, individuals possess the remarkable capacity to fundamentally rewire their innate responses to align with the objective demands of reality, rather than rigidly insisting that reality conform to their subjective intuitions. This invaluable lesson, forged in the crucible of conflict, and paid for with blood over the battlefields of Europe and the vast expanses of the Pacific, retains its profound relevance in any contemporary scenario where human beings encounter predicaments where their immediate instinctual reactions diverge sharply from the optimal, logical solution.